everyone, and welcome to M+. I'm excited to be here today to introduce Day 2 of Prada Frames, Materials in Flux. My name is Keri, and I am the lead curator for learning and interpretation here. Before I turn the mic over to Prada Frames conceiver, Simone Farresin, I'd like to take a moment to point out some of our house rules. You'll want to keep your phones on silent. You can take photos, but please don't use your flash. And please make sure there's no eating and drinking here in the grand stair. Second, I'd like to just let you know that we will try and have time for a short Q&A at the end of the panel discussion today. There's a QR code on the postcard that was on your seat. You can scan that and use the portal to insert your question whenever you want, and we'll get to them at the moment in time when it makes sense at the end of the discussion. So I'd now very warmly like to introduce you to Simone Farresin, half of the design duo Forma Fantasma, who are based in Italy, and they're also the duo who designed this symposium series for Prada and actually devised this year's theme. Simone.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you for the introduction. It's fantastic to be in Hong Kong, and that Prada Frame is now hosted at M+. So Prada Frame started last year because of conversation with the Prada team and Mrs. Prada, thinking about creating a platform to talk about the complex relationship between design, art, architecture, and the environment. Because last year, first session was hosted during the Milan Furniture Fair, we thought the perfect theme was to focus on extracting values from an ecosystem, specifically forest. This theme is somehow looking at the other side of the spectrum, not really at extracting value from an ecosystem, but rather what happens at the end of life of things. So in a way, waste. But we thought it could have been much more interesting to make the subject much wider, and we came up with this idea of materials in flux. If you think about the state of matter, it's in constant transformation. It is always in becoming. In this sense, the idea of waste, it's similar more to a concept that comes from economy that decide what has value and what has not. Prada Frames Materials in Flux is trying to put forward different ideas of interacting with materiality, looking at how materials can lead the way for a more sustainable future. I'm looking forward to the conversation today and to see how the conversation will also develop in Prada Frames in Milan, because Prada Frames Materials in Flux will also be continuing during the Milan Furniture Fair in April, where the multidisciplinarity nature of the symposium will also be taken forward with contributions from anthropologists, philosophers, but also materials experts. Thank you.
Thank you, Simone. And we are so thrilled to be hosting Prada Frames with Prada this year for the 2023 edition. The panel I'm about to introduce you to is called Sea States, and my thanks to artist Charles Lim for inspiring our title, and you'll hear a bit more from him in a few minutes. My co-curator and I, Iko Yokoyama, took inspiration from Forma Fantasma theme and wanted to respond to climate change from this particular vantage point, that of Hong Kong. A city with over 200 islands, and from our physical position, the museum literally sits on reclaimed land in Victoria Harbour. A museum is both a container of objects and ideas, and we take seriously the role we play in framing and shaping discourse and making space for our audiences to consider different points of view. As a museum of visual culture, we connect the everyday to the material world through the lenses of artists, designers, architects, and even scientists. So I'm really excited to introduce you to our panel, each of whom offer a unique perspective on this topic. So I'll start by inviting each of the artists to come and take their seat, and they'll each come and join us on the stage. So first of all, Lisa Reihana, Maori artist joining us from Aotearoa, Hong Kong-based seawater rise scientist, C.T. Low, architect and Hong Kong-based academic, Christian Lange, and Singaporean artist, Charles Lim Yong. And finally, I'll welcome our moderator, Utameta Bauer, who is curator and founding director of NTU Center for Contemporary Art in Singapore. And Uta will host this panel in a lively discussion today, and I'll turn it over to them. Thank you all for being here.
Yeah, good morning, everybody. Everybody probably has already a few days behind them seeing art, and it's great to be back here in Hong Kong after these years. And it's also wonderful to be here in this museum. It was quite a while in the making, and it's really, really wonderful to be here, and I think it's an excellent place to be and come together. Thanks also for M+ to invite us. Thanks to Prada Frames for having us, Keri, Echo, and also particular Simone and Andrea from former Phantasma to bring this together. And why this coming together is so important and so special. We talk about a quite urgent topic of our time, and that is the impact of climate change. And let's face it, we have a lot of important climate science data, but it doesn't reach everybody. So I think the arts that brings people together from all walks of life, fashion that has such an important outreach and also influence capacity, I think it's wonderful that we open those doors to have this conversation together, because we need to have these conversations together. The United Nations Climate Change Committee, they just stated 3 days ago, we are really beyond, we are already way behind the goals that were set 2015 in Paris at the COP. And it's really great this morning to have practitioners of different fields here introducing their work, their practice that goes back quite a long time, and really see where are synergies, where can we change, where can we join forces, and this advocacy for the ocean, for the environment, and of course, as Simone mentioned there, the wider framework that is the impact of this global changes that we face. I think it's really good to weave us together. I will introduce our distinct speakers this morning now in a row, and then we go one by one to give you a bit of a background what everybody does, and then we start a conversation together. So it's with great pleasure to introduce Lisa Reihana. Lisa is a multidisciplinary artist of Maori background, and through her pioneering practice combining photography, video, and installations, she employs a philosophy of making rather than taking, and the collaborative nature of her practice with an emphasis on portraiture and historical ancestral narratives is made possible with the help of family, friends, and fellow artists. And I had the pleasure to see a wonderful pavilion in the Venice Biennale a few years ago, and it really shows the impact that visual and the audio visual can really bring to us to understand something that sometimes seems so far. Her work is actively and critically weaving together the tensions between microhistories and counter-memories while examining the culture and the history of the Maori and the South Pacific Islanders in general that evolve around the vast ocean. And her most recent work at Sydney Modern, I think we'll see a photograph soon, is a superhighway, an everyday connector between indigenous voyagers from Aotearoa in New Zealand and Australia, and the pass along with ancestral stories circulation. I then have the pleasure to introduce C.T. Low, who heads the China Water Risk Geospatial Analysis work that identifies risk hotspots to plan better resilience. His focus is strongly also on sea level rise that is soon impacting Hong Kong if we don't create change. And his 3D flood maps have prompted corporates and banks to assess their coastal threats. His work has been cited by Bloomberg TV and CMP, and his models were a key input for the CWR UPACT 20 index that benchmarks coastal threats across 20 cities in APAC. He has played a major role with CWR integrating visual arts and science in collaborative projects, including M+, And yeah, his NGO is China Water Risk, CWR, that got founded in 2011, and it has been playing a pivotal and innovative role fostering this kind of link between really climate change science, real big data, but bringing also to stakeholders in the industry and in policy making, and we hear a bit more about that. Then we have a practicing architect, a fellow German, Christian Chilang, who is an associate professor at the Department of Architecture at the University of Hong Kong, where he also serves as a director of fabrication and material in the Material Technologies Lab, and he is also the founder and leader of the Robotic Fabrication Lab, an internationally renowned research environment for architectural robot fabrication, prototyping, and construction. His work also has been featured internationally and in exhibitions. ArchiReef is a collaborative project with the Swire Institute of Marine Science, SWIMS, at the University of Hong Kong, and is sought to offer climate solutions by restoring the degraded and threatened marine ecosystems. Lange and his project team developed a tailored algorithm to create biomimicry patterns on robotically 3D printed terracotta building components, something that is shared with this building. I mean, the outside of this museum is terracotta fabricated, and it's just amazing. And it's not just the material that is an important reminder of natural resources, but also terracotta in its coming to waste this afternoon, and its degradation is environmentally more friendly than a lot of the material we use in buildings. This combining expertise, joining this with a marine biology lab, we will hear more about this morning. Last but not least, I have my fellow Singaporean here, Charles Lim, an artist from Singapore whose practice since more than 15 years reflects both man-made systems and the natural world, mediated and informed by field research, drawing, photography, and digital media. And as you heard already from Keri, C-State, his long-term project, also lends the name for this morning's session. He examines the political and biophysical contours of the nation-state through the visible and invisible lenses of the sea. His work has been featured also in a solo presentation at the 56th Venice Biennale in 2015, and his most recent show, Staggered Observations of a Coast, was exhibited at SDBI Creative Workshops Gallery. His recent work that we also had the pleasure to feature at the Istanbul Biennial at the end of last year, he created, and it's still ongoing, with artist Simone Gill, which is a collaborative work really exploring also the sea as a big means in our region, also of a lived habitat. And I think that also brings together and weaves together the notion also of Lisa's work to really get a better understanding from the sea, not just as a beautiful backdrop that we enjoy and we see, but it's a lived habitat for many creatures. And I think altogether we really can show a macro picture, a micro picture, really unfolding the complexity that is at stake. And I think what is most important in all of this, that we as humans understand we are part of this habitat and should not be the dominator. And with this, I'm happy to hand over the mic to Lisa Reihana.
Thank you. Now, are we on? Yes. Could we start with the slide, please? Greetings to you all. Ngā toki mata whaurua is my waka. Hokianga is my ocean. Pūhanga Tohora is my mountain. And I am a daughter of Ngāpuhi tribe. May my ancestors embrace your ancestors. May my mountains greet your mountains. And may my gods acknowledge your gods and goddesses. I'd just like to briefly thank M+ and Prada Frames for inviting me to speak here today, and all the hardworking organisers behind the scenes, and to Usha and my fellow speakers. This image that you're seeing here is of Ground Loop, which is currently playing in the atrium at Sydney Modern, another new gallery and museum in Sydney, Australia. And what I'll do is ask for the video to please be played. So in January 2020, my concept for an ambitious and technically sophisticated and site-specific video ground loop was accepted. Ambitious because I wanted to develop a narrative in consultation with Aboriginal elders and artists. A delicate task, ideally done face-to-face, and complex due to the technical requirements of the screen, which is 20 metres by 5 metres wide. The area where Sydney Modern and the Art Gallery of New South Wales are built is contentious, a site of British colonisation. The Art Gallery in New South Wales building next door was originally meant to face Woolloomooloo Harbour, but a last-minute decision saw it turned around 180 degrees looking across the Royal Botanic Gardens to face Government House. This now represented a triumvirate of colonial power and oppression. The Sydney Modern building features glass facades with magnificent views of Woolloomooloo Harbour, and this afforded me an opportunity to recall historic Maori trade routes between New Zealand and Australia in the early 1800s. My Trans-Tasman project sought to poetically tackle urgent issues with these aspirations. Set in an indeterminate future, or perhaps an alternative now, Ground Loop honours Indigenous customs and cultural knowledge. It recognises the respect that traditional custodians hold for their land and seas. Embracing Indigenous spirituality, Ground Loop highlights how living consciously alongside the land and sea is the way forward for a sustainable, culturally positive and hopeful future. A future where the people of our region freely travel and connect with one another. I'm of Maori heritage, and so we speak of emanating from gods and goddesses, like a Greek pantheon, but perhaps just a little less murderous. Ground, earth, whenua, land. Papatuanuku is our Maori goddess of Mother Earth. Her husband is Ranganui, Sky Father, and together they begat many children, including Tangaroa, god of the sea, and grandfather of sea creatures, Ikatiri, the ancestor of fish, and Tutiwanawana, the ancestor of reptiles. While Tangaroa is all-powerful, his domain resides over the body of Papatuanuku. Our oral histories reveal the ancestry of the natural world, and this is why I am talking about land even as we gather to speak about the ocean. In Māoridom, the concept of kaitiaki, a guardian, or kaitiaki-tanga, custodianship, is highly valued. So as kaitiaki, if we tend to Earth Mother, by extension we tend to the ocean and all the living things in the ocean, and so on. We look after them, they support us. And to propose my theory, New Zealand was the last place on Earth to be settled. Our neighbours, the Australian Aborigines, are one of the longest living peoples on Earth. So I consider Australia and New Zealand as the place where the world reconnects, where the end of the world meets the beginning of the world, an Ouroboros or snake swallowing its tail. I'm fascinated by bathymetrical maps of the ocean floor. And as the tidal ground loop nods to this unbroken earthly connection, above it is the Tasman Sea that forms a watery bridge between New Zealand and Australia, us Indigenous peoples. So I started by creating a 3D CGI world using satellite data and seabed topography to map country from Sydney across the Tasman seafloor all the way to Hokianga Harbour in New Zealand's North Island. Pre-production began just as Australia and New Zealand struggled with natural disasters, fires, floods and droughts. And then the difficulties and uncertainties of the coronavirus closed our borders. The world changed. And these all-important and hopeful face-to-face cultural conversations were now in jeopardy. As the new Sydney Modern building is built in this area here, which was a naval base, it gave me thoughts of how to usurp colonial histories. I'd noticed how the revival of making traditional Aboriginal bark canoes had just been occurring in the past few years. In New Zealand and across the Pacific, we have been building waka haurua. So, to divert just ever so briefly, I wanted to use this conversation and also talk about the Austronesian lines. The Micronesian navigator Maupia was the man who shared his knowledge about the navigation systems which rely on an embodied knowledge of the sun and stars, winds and clouds, sea swells, birds and fish. His knowledge is preserved at the Polynesian Voyaging Society and is something that was really inspired my ways of thinking about sustainability, making a connection between the Pacific Aboriginal communities who are now using these bark canoes. I think I'd like to just make a few brief remarks about how this project really allowed me to work with a lot of blackfella artists, including Studio Gile, who helped with animation, Maddie Gibbs, who created spirit figures, costumes that featured fig tree roots, native barks, shell middens, all recorded in Sydney's inner city and were designed by Matt Stegg. Uncle John Kelly made 4 woi or ngawi, and these are the traditional bark canoes. And after the filming, he generously gifted 2 of them to me. So my futuristic waka haurua vessel is inspired by Banksia flora and Pacific wave patterns. Today I've shared some Māori philosophies. My hope is Ground Loop may inspire scientists, thinkers, eco-warriors and the next generation. These codified visuals interspersed with personal mythologies. No industrial practices that plunder Tangaroa's gifts or desecrate ancient habitats. I show fishermen catching seafood, Mother Nature's bounty, just one fish at a time. These ideas of sustainability and living in sync are implicit, but no less political. While Ground Loop isn't a blueprint of how to achieve this utopian world, it does assert that it can exist. And here I sing it into existence. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Lisa. I think this gives us a really much more general introduction, really, what is this ocean also as a habitat and as a wider part of this world. And I think CT, you will jump us right into the urban context of it all. So welcome, CT.
Hi. Thank you for having me here today. I'm so excited to be able to talk about the ocean with people who are working in creative industry, which is something quite different from what I'm doing. At CWR, most of the time my work is focused on the science and the risk aspect of water and the ocean and deal with a lot of facts and figures. So my role is kind of like a translator of science to bridge the gap between science and business and finance or the public. Coincidentally, I think the ocean has always been part of my life because actually I grew up in Malaysia in a small town by seaside. And now I find myself living in a much bigger city also by the sea. And sadly, ocean warming and sea level rise are happening faster than we thought since the past century. And this clearly will have an implication for us. Look how close we are to water now. We're sitting in the building just next to the Victoria Harbour. And it's not just Hong Kong, but many Asian cities are also by the sea. Singapore, Jakarta, Bangkok, Shanghai, Tokyo, they are all vulnerable to rising seas. Indeed, Asia is the most vulnerable to rising seas, which is why we need to take this opportunity to reimagine Hong Kong. And it's not just Hong Kong, but all cities in Asia as to how to protect our cities from rising seas. But of course, at the same time, we must rein in carbon emissions. Otherwise, we would end up like this because mountain glaciers and polar ice sheets are melting faster. Seas are also rising faster. This is why the Global Authority of Climate Science has warned us that multi-meter sea level rise cannot be ruled out by 2100. And this is what multi-meter sea level rise will look like to Hong Kong. And clearly, we need to fast-track decarbonization, which we are not doing enough. In Hong Kong, our annual emission is about 33 megatons per year, which is nothing compared to the rest of the world. Even the carbon emissions from just one Siberia fire could already be multiple times of Hong Kong annual emissions, which is why we all need to fast-track emissions. So you probably wonder, what can we do as an individual? Because the problem is so big and we are so small, which is why I want to share with you this next slide, please. This is the report that we published last year off the back of the IPCC, which is the Global Authority on Climate Change, recommending that individual can actually make a big difference. Because according to the co-chair of the IPCC, if we change our consumption and lifestyles, we can actually cut 40 to 70% of our emission, which is a lot. And it could also help us to slow down the sea level rise. So what can we do? 3 things. And this is not very difficult. I ask you to do 1, just to cut 25% of your food waste. 2, don't eat 1 steak per week. And 3, when you're watching your videos, just watch half of them using Wi-Fi instead streaming on mobile data. And if enough of us do this, we can save carbon emissions even more than Macau, which is not very difficult to do, just 3 things. Not only we could save carbon emission, we can also save our cities from rising seas, which is clearly something I want to do. At CWR, I use geospatial analysis and maps to highlight areas that are vulnerable to rising seas and what this means to our finance, economy, even our home, or our basic needs such as our food and energy security. we need to think a way forward to reimagine our cities, because clearly just building one seawall is not going to solve all the problems, because our city is so coastal, and we are so clustered in low-lying reclaimed land, because we have 25% of reclaimed land, which house more than 27% of our population and 70% of our economic activities, which means Hong Kong is very exposed to rising seas, and not just Hong Kong, but also other Asian cities. And because we have reclaimed so many lands from the sea, if we keep doing things that are hurting our planet or the ocean, eventually the seas are going to reclaim our land. It's very hard to imagine sea level rise because it's happening slowly, and it's also very hard to push for habit change. This is why we need art to show us the impact of how we will feel through water will be, and also influence the lifestyle, the trends, and so on. Which is why I think it's great that we have this event today to include science and arts, the impacts on finance, the whole work, because together we need to think a way forward. Before I end this, I would like to invite all of you, the artists out there, to help us to emote these facts and figures, because we are sitting on a lot of these facts and figures, but facts and figures are just facts and figures. They need some emotion to help us to connect with it, as connected to the issue as I am. Thank you.
Thanks so much, CT, and I think it's really good to, on the one side, look up the larger picture, but then to break it down also to doable solutions, because a lot of people become very fatalistic. It will happen anyway, what can I do? Yep. Let's just move on. But we can do something, and I think it's also great to give this like 3 examples. That brings us to Christian, who really works. I think this is already kind of emoting the ocean, like it really shows an architectural solution, but it also shows very clearly that the ocean is a lived habitat. And Christian, the floor is yours.
Okay. Yeah, thank you, Ute, for the nice introduction. Thank you, M+, for inviting me. Thank you, Prada Frames, for organizing this event. I'm very glad to be here today. So I'm an architect, a maker, and an educator. And for the past 15 years, I've been teaching at the University of Hong Kong, and my interest is mostly in computational design and fabrication. So, but today I want to show you a project which is kind of stepping outside my usual, let's say, expertise as an architect, which is kind of a project in the ocean. And so I want to kind of share with you how actually fabrication and new technology can as well help to maybe save or save some of the endangered species we have in the ocean. So in 2016, I founded and pioneered the Robotic Fabrication Lab, which kind of gave me as well the opportunity to delve even more into novel methods of fabrication, in this case, 3D printing. And not long after I opened that lab, I was approached by Dr. David Baker of the Swire Institute of Marine Biology at the HKU, who was very interested in teaming up on a project to actually tackle one issue, which is in Hong Kong, but it's actually around the entire world, which is basically deterioration of coral colonies. So this happens really like around the world. And one of the 2 main issues why this happens, why these coral colonies are dying, is on one hand you have pollution in the ocean, and on the other hand you have climate change, which kind of rises basically the temperature level. To cope with that, many scientists and researchers around the world are starting to kind of come up with solutions. So one solution is actually to work with so-called coral restoration, where you take coral fragments and you grow these coral fragments first and then implant them again on a natural rock or so to kind of basically grow again coral colonies. Now in the case of Hong Kong, the problem was like this site is up in Sai Kung, and it's a very muddy water a little bit, but it's also like over time the seabed became very sandy, so no natural rock was basically there to kind of put these coral fragments anywhere. So usually what you do when you try to implant these coral fragments then on such a site, you work with an artificial substrate or like a foundation for them. In many cases, this has been concrete. Now concrete, the problem with concrete is that it has a relatively high pH level. So freshly poured concrete has like about 13 to 15 pH. The pH level of the ocean is about 8. Coral environments, they thrive, like I think, in an environment from 7.5 to 8.3 or so. So the material is quite important, how to kind of like build this substrate. Now, when I started this robotic fabrication lab, one of the questions I had is like, what kind of material would be interesting actually for architecture in the context of Hong Kong and China? So China, ceramics was one of the materials I thought like was very interesting to me because it's kind of like one of the oldest material systems we have actually as human beings to build or to make architecture. Now the great thing about ceramics or terracotta is actually that the pH level is around 7.5. Well, it depends on what kind of material it is, but like I think it ranges between 6.5 to 7.5. So much closer actually to the pH level you need for corals. Yeah. So we were awarded then in 2019, I believe, by AFCD of Hong Kong to do a test run of so-called 3D printed coral, artificial coral reefs. So we designed them. It took quite a bit to design them because like this material is very difficult to work with. So we spent about a couple of months to designing them, to test them, that they're structurally sound, that they also incorporate basically the needs the marine biologist set out, which was, for instance, that it needed to be porous because corals don't like any kind of sedimentation, so that the sedimentation goes through, et cetera, et cetera. And then eventually we finished designing them in early 2020, I believe, and then fabricated them for a couple of months and finished them in June 2020. They're now in the Hong Kong waters since 2.5 years. So they were implemented in July 2020. And they're actually working very well. So I think the survival rate of all these corals is right now by 80 to 90%. And they're actually thriving. Now, I have to kind of say, this might be not a solution for everything, yeah, because climate change is happening, temperatures of waters are rising, so we can't change that with this solution. But what this might be is, because in other places as well, the temperature might rise, so then those might be new habitats for corals. So this might be really like a good way to actually populate ocean beds with this device. I want to kind of like show a video which is basically showing more my side, which is like the fabrication process. So to finish, I enjoyed this project very much because it was kind of, it helped me to understand actually a totally new territory. It helped my counterpart, like the marine biologist, to work with somebody in the making to solve actually like an urgent problem we have, yeah? And it might be just like a small stepping stone to kind of, for the future to kind of help us tackling some of these problems we have right now as a society around the world. So thank you very much, and I...
Yes, thank you. Thanks so much, Christian. I'm really glad also that Lisa and you also bring the perspective from under the water. Most of us don't look under the water. We see the ocean from the top, but there's so much going on down there. And then our last speaker in the session, Charles Lim, is not only an artist, but he's also a professional sailor. So I think he saw the ocean a lot from under the water, capsizing. So, Charles,
yeah,
it's
thanks.
yours.
Thanks for inviting me to this talk, and everyone. And my name is Charles. And actually, the body of work that I was working on was called Sea State, and currently I'm moving on to a new body of work called Zone of Convergence, actually. And it's in collaboration with Simmons Gill, and both of us are actually on a fellowship with Singapore Art Museum. So thanks to them. And what happened as an introduction is that actually the work that I was working on Sea State was mainly about Singapore, actually, and what we had done to the sea in Singapore. And mainly, actually, Singapore is kind of like expanded using land reclamation, and more than half of its sea is actually now land. And how that happened was that Singapore felt that it was too small, and then just expanded. And also part of the process, how it happened was that actually in the 70s, there was this colonial kind of law that we had inherited called the Foreshores Act, actually. And it meant that the public coast had to be public access to the public, actually. And ironically, actually, there are many communities that were living along the coast, and they had houses actually on the coast. And that's actually, and a lot of the Malays, they live in houses that are on stilts in the sea itself, actually. And the reason for that is that we're very lucky in this region because we live in this area called the Sunda Shelf. And the Sunda Shelf is actually is this shallow area that starts from Malacca Straits all the way to the water's line. And if you go to the deepest point, say like in the Java Sea, it's only like 50 meters deep, So the thing is that the water temperature fluctuation actually is very little. It's very, very stable. It doesn't go cold, doesn't go hot, it just stays the same. In fact, the temperature of the sea is actually almost the same temperature as my blood temperature. Because when I was living in Kampong, I lived in a kampong with my grandmother, and she was like making whitewash from seashells. Actually, just kind of like, that's a bad thing for the sea. She was taking the seashells and making like lime. And I remember living along the coast, and when there was the monsoon, it was called the big monsoon, the northeast monsoon. It would be quite cold, actually, because the air was coming from the Sumatra mountainside. And it would get so cold that I would actually jump in the water. And the water was actually warmer than the air temperature. So I would like my head would be in the water like that, and then once in a while I'd come up, breathe a bit, and I'll tip in. So the relationship between body and water actually is, in this region, is actually the water is seen as a safe space, actually, and land is actually where the mosquitoes are, and you're going to die there. And it's like, and so for the Malays, actually, they saw the sea as the land, actually, in a sense, and then so it's inverse, actually. The water became a cultural territorial space, and many of the families, they actually interconnected through the waters, actually, rather than the land. It's only through when colonization came, then it inversed, actually. And then a lot of these areas were like shallow, and then when they're shallow, the deep ships couldn't come in, and then there was only two outcomes to it. Either you dredge it becomes deeper so the ship can go through, or you fill up your land, and then you can so-called like history begins, property begins actually. So those people that are living along the coast, it's not seen as like, oh, that's the thing actually. That was a non-thing. So what happened was that in Singapore in the 70s actually attracted, there was this thing called the Foreshores Act, and a lot of the communities that were living along the coast, they got moved into the center of Singapore. And right now, if you go to Singapore, actually, you talk to any Singaporean, or your own, as a tourist, you don't feel like you're on an island, actually. And Singapore is an island. You just feel like, you don't feel the coast, actually. So for this project, actually, that I was working with Simone Gill, we're kind of like looking at this region, actually, in a sense. And this area, like, there are many ways of describing it, the equatorial, the global south. But now we're kind of like thinking like, maybe there's a different way of looking at it through looking at the weather systems, actually, because it's a lot more like formless and it shifts around. I think maybe it could be, it's not so fixed, actually. And it's quite interesting because there's this thing called the zone of convergence. A lot of the pilots, they use it. The real name is called the intertropical zone of convergence. It's actually two weather systems. The northern hemisphere actually spins I think it's anti-clockwise, and then the southern actually is clockwise. So when they converge, actually they cancel each other out. And then a lot of the sailors, historically, they always call this place the place of doldrums, laziness. So there's this connotation of like non-productivity, nothing happens here. But actually, as a sailor, actually is a place of a lot of drama, actually. When you stand along the coast in Singapore, you see like 3 storms, one here, one there, and you don't know which one will take over, actually. It's like 3 gods, converging, and then many times nothing happens because they cancel each other out, actually. But sometimes one will take over, but then the wind will shift very quickly. So it's a place that is very confounding, actually. So actually, for this video that I'm going to show you is me and Simone were like taking these like bus boats actually along in Riau, going along these like communities in Indonesia, actually, which is actually just outside Singapore, and people still exist like that, actually. So we're trying to kind of like reconnect and see like how this is actually. How do you live in the shallow? And that's the other word we're using also, the shallow. And we're talking about climate change and like also like things gonna like flood, and we have this fear of the water flooding like maybe up to here, and then destroying everything. It's like the other question is like, how do we live with that also? So we can play this video. So the first one is the collaboration with Simone on the bus boats.
Haji Burhan, Pak Haji to some, Haji Burhan.
And it was interesting during the time we were making this.
A skipper on one of
it was during COVID, so we couldn't go back to the island. So we actually
islands.
simply just asked the boatman to shoot the thing. So the whole thing was shot by him.
Cameras and asked him to be eyes. Look for storms.
And there's a certain kind of rhythm on these boats.
Forget to film
They go to houses and when the house is in the sea, actually the front of the house is not facing the land.
We
It's
were
actually
asking
facing
Haji Bur to find a memory
it's actually
for us
facing
by
the
throwing
sea.
a net, to be our fisherman,
And school
to
kids go on the
cast
boat,
out into the ether,
things, posts,
into the daily
money is
passage of
exchanged,
his
everything goes through the
vessels
boat,
back
actually.
and forth, in the hope he would catch something. What was it? We couldn't give instructions because there were none.
This is
to give.
Simone's voice.
Just look for storms was the closest we got to describing what we were hunting. Had we gone back to the islands to do this work, if we dare call it that, I've no doubt we would have felt always on the wrong boat.
And you see the
left
storm is
behind.
very dramatic, actually. It's like
It's
curtain,
ourselves
just
we are in
coming through.
pursuit of, that fleetingly encountered coming together by coming apart. And now we're on a quest, chasing a puck that breaks into more and more fragments as it drifts further and further ahead of us. And further and
This video is
further
abridged,
behind.
actually. It's a bit long. It's actually a lot longer.
But surely, if it was real, it must be holdable, we tell ourselves. And if it was real, it must be catchable. Is light catchable in pigment? Are memories catchable in our bodies? like a pillion rider on a motorcycle taking a fast, steep curve on a stormy day. Once you've been there and noticed, ever after you're left chasing a spectre.
These are quite common actually, water spouts. So this other video is actually
I remember from my husband's
interview I'd done with this lady, this family actually, a Jewish family that came with the British actually. He was actually a ship surgeon with Raffles. And the family kind of like lived on.
But the house was built by the family.
And they owned this house actually in the sea. It was built British style, but actually copied from the Malays actually. It was built concrete. And
just underneath
at that point in time, I thought that nobody was living along the coast. But this guy was a very famous lawyer, and he managed to hang on to this house. So it's the last house, actually.
Because in the morning when we wake up,
actually passed on, and then the house.
The swallows going out.
So they moved out, actually. Yeah.
And in the evening, the swallows would come back, and then the bats would go out. The Sultan of Johor came to visit.
And the people who live along the coast, their connection with like the neighbors is very porous actually. It's like the Sultan was actually from Malaysia. He would just come over and have tea in the house and then go off.
And carried the Sultan on their backs.
But since you see this house here, it's actually collapsed. This house is actually totally collapsed.
Entertain him to.
Because nobody was there. And
breakfast. If I were to invite anybody, they said, "Wow, so far."
And then in this other video, I have actually, okay, it seems really heroic, like wow, you know, this person is so brave, floating in the sea. I was kind of interested in like passive transgression. So what happens is that actually I went to the second link, the Malaysia causeway is quite high, and then I got my friend Alfian to like float in the sea, and then he'll float to Malaysia, and then the tide will turn, and he'll float back to Singapore. Yeah, and you will see, it seems like very heroic. Oh, this guy's so brave, but actually the water is it's the same temperature as the body. So actually he fell asleep. He said like it was really relaxing. Yeah. Yeah, that's the last thing. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks so much, Charles. I think this last image of a body floating in water, and as you said, your friend Alfian fell asleep. The ocean actually cares for us if we are not fighting the ocean, if you're not pushing it back all the time, if we really understand to have a coexistence. And I think your presentations really show different aspects of that and how can we maybe connect more. But a lot of the world's population actually doesn't live at the ocean, and it's unfortunately the land-based humans who create 98% of the CO2 emissions. And it's very often very difficult to bring across like the voice of Pacific Islanders who generate roughly 2% of the CO2 emissions in the world, who say they are the most vulnerable to sea level rise and to climate change, cyclones, etc. And a lot of the people always say, yeah, but it's just like a few people living on these islands, and why can't they relocate, etc. So maybe from your perspective, and I mean, Lisa, you for sure have a lot to say to that, who actually owns the ocean? That's a question to all of you.
Gosh, hadn't thought of it. I will consider that. I thought I'd start by thinking about the Pacific, because like Asia, the Pacific is very much under pressure. There are a lot of, in fact, there are already refugees, people who don't have anywhere to live anymore. They're already being relocated. That's really certain islands where nuclear bombs have been dropped. You know, they're poisoned, they're poisonous places. But I thought it might be useful to share a thought that I heard in a symposium a couple of years ago. And it was an Aboriginal man talking at the Sydney Biennale, and the concept behind the theme for that year was rivers or rivers. And I think it's something that, whether you're landlocked or by the sea, what he suggested is that each of us choose one animal, some endemic or native animal, and decide to look after it, just one thing. And by doing that, and being a kaitiaki, that word that I was sharing before, a custodian, through looking after one animal, you would then have to think about the habitat, the quality of the water, the quality of the food that one animal requires. And then by doing one simple thing, the ripples actually extend outwards. And I thought that's kind of quite a productive way of thinking about how to move forward in the world. It's a bit like what you've talked about, you know, these 3 things that we can do, breaking it down, because the worry is that it's so overwhelming, the issues that are facing Mother Earth and the oceans at present, that these are, it's one way of thinking about how could we make a step forward. And I would personally like to say one of the big issues that we have is plastic. It's a really massive issue in the Pacific Islands, and I imagine it would be here across all the islands of Asia as well. The amount of plastic that is just sort of leaching into the animals and into fish and everywhere. I mean, I think carrying a bottle and just using it is one very, very simple thing that we can also do. Thanks.
I just want to add on something. It's not just the plastic waste, but I think many of us haven't thought about the medicines that we're taking, like the pharmaceutical waste, antibiotic. Now the scientists also found this kind of substance of waste in the ocean, but not many people are aware of this as well. So I think we always take the ocean as a dump place for all the things that we don't want. But actually, none of us actually owns the ocean, but ocean is really important for all of us. It is one of the largest carbon sink because it helps us to absorb the carbon dioxide and also help us to absorb the heat, because I think for the last 25 years, the heat that absorbed by the ocean is equivalent to dropping 7 atomic bombs into the ocean every second for the last 30 years, and which is a lot. If we don't have this ocean, then the atmosphere will suddenly feel much hotter. And the ocean also, because the phytoplankton, is the source of our oxygen. 50 to 80% of our oxygen is actually coming from the oceans. So I think it's really important that we protect our ocean and stop hurting them.
So who owns the ocean? Well, I think all of us own the ocean. I think technically probably the countries who are on the shoreline. So for instance, in this project, we have to kind of ask the Hong Kong government to do this project. If this would be a different country, we would have to work always with governments to do a project as such. Yeah? But I think like what's important is that, for instance, in the ecosystem of corals, and I'm not a marine biologist or so, yeah, but if one of these ecosystems is deteriorating, that kind of has an impact on a lot of other ecosystems. So many fish hide in these corals, yeah. So if they don't have like these hideout spaces anymore, then other predators came in. So it can just that like one kind of ecosystem is destabilized, can destabilize the entire ecosystem. So it's very important to look at very carefully at all these issues, you know, like, and I don't know, I feel like a friend of mine, she did once like a kind of a research on all these corals, what's actually impacting. I think to help probably projects such as the one we did, you probably need to kind of see it as well from a kind of a business point of view, yeah, because so many people are dependent actually on all these ecosystems, yeah. I mean, we are in Asia, we eat a lot of fish here, yeah, so all these resources. Yeah? They're kind of dependent on all these ecosystems. Yeah? So a lot of people are dependent on these jobs. Yeah? So it's a very, very complex kind of issue, I would say. But if you were to kind of see this really like in numbers somehow, then I think you need to sort of speak to the right people, to speak to the right governments, to really make it like a top priority to maintain that ecosystem, you know, that this is really, and I think, you know, there are issues about the ecosystem here in Asia. They're different than maybe in Europe or in America, and corals is just one of them, you know.
I think I think the problem is that actually the sea is a very romantic space, and our romanticism kind of like sometimes has a negative effect on it actually, and it's seen as also like very like a very macho space where you have the biggest ship with the biggest guns, you know, then you own it actually. This idea of freedom, you can do what you want, has, you know, it's almost irresponsible in that sense actually. And I guess all sort of things happen in the sea because it's totally militarized and corporatized actually. There's nobody really like looking at the resource. And then it was one interesting thing actually. I was like reading the book. There's this book, I think it was published by some Australian university actually, researchers. It's called Sea and Sovereignty actually, and how Indonesia actually made their sea sovereign. And then there's several kind of like interesting cases actually, like the Dutch actually, they had problems like controlling their seas actually, because there's such a big body of water inside Indonesia that before it was like this, you know, if the water was away from this, so many miles away from the coast, this is very not fixed actually, this idea, but what happens is that if it's so many miles away from the coast, actually, it's like free space. Anyone can go in. And what happened was that actually there was a shallow spot where the indigenous people, the Indonesians, were actually using it to harvest. They actually took care of a kind of like a clan area, and to them that's the sea actually. But what happened was that there were Australian colonial people actually from Australia coming in and actually harvesting that, and then the indigenous people went to the Dutch and said like, hey, they're taking our thing, and then there was just became like this very difficult situation actually. So I thought that was an interesting case actually. So we had these like cases of of grayness actually. There's a lot of grayness in the sea, and this happens, and a lot of hijinks happens actually.
Yeah, I think this land...
People get away with things, basically.
With land is pretty clear. I mean, like, we occupy it, we create borders, we defend these borders, but what is very stunning, that beyond the national range into the ocean, that is belonging kind of to the nation that is next to the coastline, and beyond the EEZ zones, actually, the sea is not owned by anybody. It's if it comes to the water column, it's the International Law of the Sea Committee who gives guidance. Yeah. And it's accepted or not, and the sea ground, the seabed, is the United Nations Seabed Authority. But again, it's a guidance. So the sea is very unregulated, and the sea moves. So the sea impacts all of us. So I think we're really talking about a very complex and very challenging space, legally, ownership-wise. And I think it's so interesting, Lisa, because what you showed is also that humans, like particular First Nation people, and indigenous people, communities, always saw themselves more as guardians of the ocean, not like as the owners. This is why I was asking this, and we are part of that life. But I think we also have, we still have the possibility also of you having questions, because we have here people who really take agency of that space, and might be a great opportunity to ask them some questions. Let me see what we have. Okay, so there's a question. How do you foresee scientists, architects, and artists collaborate in bringing awareness of this urgent issue? I mean, one example we see today, but Is there a possibility of you working together, for example?
Yes, we've already exchanged cards. I mean, these symposiums are very useful in that regard because there are opportunities for conversations. You know, they can be very productive. And I mean, when I think of the ocean, I'm thinking of bodies of water, not just the ocean, but the rivers that run into the sea. I mean, it's a much bigger, it's bigger than just the ocean because there's a free flow of any material that goes into the rivers, they go out to the seas, and I've just been sharing ideas of, there's a lot of Maori kaitiaki and custodianship, wresting it from the hands of the government and putting into place, just using science and looking at old techniques and adapting them for today's issues. I think that we have a very agricultural system in New Zealand, and so there's a lot of runoff of phosphates into the waters, and they're changing the waterways. I mean, it's interesting to create an artwork that shows this kind of free flow of boats and wakas, these indigenous vessels. But travelling around the world are these massive vessels, and on the bottoms of them are, they're hitchhikers from different places. And one of the things we need to be very careful of is each habitat has its own environment. So therefore, these conversations are very important to talk and to share information. I think with today's technologies, it's more and more possible to do that. And I think, that the fact that you're a sailor and people who go out into the sea and have a different experience of how wonderful it can be, but also it's a very, it's a dangerous space. You need to know, you need to have your wits about you. And I think that's something that I wanted to translate in with my waka, is the idea that there's a woman who's leading, is on board. It's a female navigator. Which goes back to actually the woman who first found New Zealand and named it, just to start thinking about these spaces and not to feminise them, but just to bring another layer of care and our duty of care when we're thinking about the world and how we are in it.
I mean, Charles and CT, you're both working kind of like you understand also this, I mean, all of you, the pressure to coastal cities by the water. So most of the cities actually fighting the water, they fight sea level rise. Charles, we spoke a little bit yesterday. Can you say something about Singapore's attitude?
Yeah, Singapore has kind of like accepted that the sea level is going to rise by 5 meters. So what's happened is that Singapore has done a lot of reclamation, and actually our neighbors have banned the sale of sand to Singapore. Malaysia banned, Indonesia banned, because 7 islands actually disappeared because we took so much sand from them. And then we were taking from Cambodia, and then what happened was that they banned also, some NGO sued us. And then I think we're getting from Myanmar, and then if you go to Alibaba.com, you do a search, Singapore leopard sand reclamation, I think there'll be some hits. Yeah, and so you can contribute to land reclamation in Singapore. So what's happened is that reclamation, but we need reclamation for constructions for buildings also. So there was this fight, like, we need it for our building maintenance rather than reclamation. So actually reclamation slowed down in 2000 onwards. And what happened was that suddenly this climate change came out, and then the Straits Times came out with this interactive video. I think it'll be interesting if we can put it out. They actually show the city how it's going to flood. Like, look at the banks are going to flood and your money's going to go. So right now, at this point in time, actually, they're really going to go ahead with it, actually. The East Coast was actually, of Singapore, the East Coast Park was actually a reclaimed site. And currently, the plan is to reclaim that part all the way to the border of Singapore, right to the Indonesian border. And we're going to build a polder, actually, and start, like, kind of like fortifying ourselves from sea level rise. So they're going ahead with it.
It's interesting when you were talking about the foreshore. There's been some really big political advocacy from Māori to the New Zealand government. Foreshore actually goes back to Roman law. And Roman law, it was a decree. It meant that people could go down and collect oysters. So it's the idea that even the government would allow you to use the sea to sustain yourself. Yeah. And the law that we have, which is more colonial, is the Queen's Chain, which is the idea that you can only go up, everyone can have access to the edge of the ocean and the edge of land up to where the waves break. Yeah. So that's actually a public space. And it's interesting and scary to think about these shifts, and now with climate change, sea level rising, and in Venice at the moment, they're lacking water. So the canals are dropping. So where does that Queen's Chain sit? So I think it's going to be a very interesting discussion. If you took that as an idea, the idea of foreshore that everyone should be able to feed themselves. Yeah. I think it's quite beautiful, but it's been co-opted and used and pushed in these kind of colonial times. Yeah. So.
In fact, in Singapore, actually, when they took it away, they put a fence. So it was taken away, but then actually now we have no access to the coast.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm afraid that we're coming to a very close, but also in light of you seem to be a bit shy of asking questions. So I would propose these 4 wonderful individuals are staying here with us a little bit in the lounge, and you maybe feel more free to talk to them directly about all of these issues, because it's really an urgency, and I think we're all very happy that so many of you came this morning to listen to this, because it needs this collaborative conversation. I mean, CT showed what each and any of us can do, eating 1 steak less. Basically, there is something each of us can do, and I think this afternoon we hear a lot also about waste and waste management, and you mentioned already the ocean is unfortunately also used like a big dumpster. Mm-hmm. So I hope we can have a wonderful conversation together now also over lunch, and really, really thank you so much for these contributions, and I think we need much more of these conversations across disciplines, across fields, but also across nations. And I give the word back to Keri.
Thank you, everyone, and I want to say a big thank you to the panel. It was really inspiring to hear all of you, and I would say we did run out a little bit of time, so what I was going to say is that there were a few questions asked that I hope you can bring out to the lounge, and as someone who leads public programming for M+, it gives me great confidence in thinking about how we can continue this conversation in our future programs. So I think there's a lot more here. Someone asked about sort of how do we bring public accessibility to these topics, and our role as a museum is to do that with you. So please join us in the future as we continue to dig into these topics. It's a really important conversation for M+ to be hosting. So I just want to point out that at 5 p.m. This afternoon, we have Reconceiving Materials Circulation, where we have sort of 3 different duets looking at different ways that material waste is used in our everyday lives across economies, geographies, and even the human experience. So I think that'll be a really rich panel with designers, artists, and different architects thinking about this topic. But for now, I'd love you to join us in the lounge, and your QR codes do get you access into the M+ collections in case you want to have a look around, so do join us there as well. So thank you so much, everyone, for being here. Really enjoyed it. And thank you so much for being here today. It was a great pleasure to host you here. Thank you.